Well, thank you for having me here. I'm used to standing in a lecture, although I may wander the room and shout at you. I don't know. Well, thanks for having me here. I'm going to try to. I had to set my phone because I was warned I had to end at a quarter to 10, and I have a tendency to keep talking until people haul me off. So, as Bob knows, once I get going, Bob O'Gorman knows, once I get going, it just seems to keep going. And for me, it's a very exciting topic. It's a topic about what happens in the Middle Ages, which you may not find that exciting. I find a lot of undergraduates are not that interested in it anymore, but I do my best. So one of the things we want to talk about is we want to talk about that period that starts around 711, right? 711 is when Muslims invade Spain and conquer what is then a Christian society run by the Visigoths, right? The Visigoths who invade Spain in the 5th century, take over, and eventually by the beginning of the 6th century convert to Catholicism. The Visigoths are Christians, but they are Arian Christians. They're followers of Arius of Alexandria. And at the end of the 6th century, they convert to Roman Catholicism. And for the next 120 some odd years, the Visigoths become one of the most important groups of Orthodox, in the sense of Catholic Orthodox Christians in Western Europe. The Visigoths, the councils of Toledo, the bishops in Toledo, are really very important in formulating how medieval Christianity goes. Isidore of Seville in the south of Spain, Saint Isidore of Seville is one of the most important figures in the early Middle Ages in terms of doctrine, in terms of setting up how Christians will live their lives in accordance with doctrine over the next 1,000 years. And Isidore today is still a very important early church father. Well, what happens in 711 is Muslims invade and they conquer Spain. They conquer right up to the mountain range in the far north. My wife referred to it, a term which is odd since I've been studying Spain for 40 years, a term I'd never heard before, green Spain. If you've been to Spain, it's a very arid part of the world, except on that little bit of mountainous fringe in the far north in Basque Country, Asturias, and Galicia, which receives plenty of rain. So that is all that's left to the Christians, is the far north of Spain. And settling in Cordoba, the Muslims began to build what we come to know as Al-Andalus. Present term Andalusia, but Al-Andalus is the Arabic word for Spain. And they begin to establish a Muslim dominance that will last till around the year 1000, 1020 or so, when it falls into civil war. But there will be a Muslim polity, there will be a Muslim kingdom in Spain right up until January 2nd, 1492. In fact, the voyage of Columbus, to some extent, and we'll talk about the voyage of Columbus, the end of that era, next week. But we want to talk about the beginning of that era this week. So if we look at where Muslims are occupying Spain, where Muslims are in control of Spain, we go from 711, right there at the beginning of the 8th century, to 1492, when the Kingdom of Granada is finally defeated by Ferdinand and Isabella after a 10-year war to take the Kingdom of Granada away from the Nasserids. The Nasserids are the dynasty that controls that kingdom. Somewhere in the middle there, around the year 1010 to about 1215 or so, 1220. During that period, there's a transitional period where Christians get their bearings and begin to push back. You may have heard of the Reconquista, where the Christian Spanish, and again, when we talk about Spanish, Spain is a product of 1492. Well, 1474. Before 1474, it would be more accurate to talk about the Spains, as there are a number of independent kingdoms. It's the marriage of Ferdinand and Isabella that put together Spain. Well, what happens in 711 is as the Muslims move in, they begin to impose their way of life, their religion, upon the Iberian Peninsula. And they do so in accordance with a set of guidelines that come out of very early Islam. Islam arises in what is today Saudi Arabia around the year 610, when Muhammad, a merchant who styles himself prophet, believes he receives a revelation from God. And that revelation is a revelation delivered by the archangel Gabriel, right? So Gabriel appears to Muhammad. If Gabriel appears to you, you are in the monotheistic complex that includes Judaism, Christianity, and now Islam. And that revelation is a revelation of a very strict monotheism, in the sense that there is only one God, and that God's name is the God. The God in Arabic is Allah. So it's a return. Muhammad, to some extent, imagines it, or it's portrayed as a return to the God of Abraham. In fact, if you recall, Abraham has a son before he has Isaac, and that son is, right, Ishmael. And Hagar and Ishmael, Hagar, the mother of Ishmael, are driven into the desert to die by Sarah. Sarah becomes jealous and drives them to the desert. But Ishmael and Hagar are preserved, and that branch becomes the Arabs. That's the other branch of Semitic people. The Jews by Isaac, the Arabs by Ishmael. And so Muhammad imagines himself as returning to the God of Abraham, strictly monotheistic. Well, this turns out to be a remarkably powerful and remarkably important moment in the history of the world. He convinces the people of Arabia that he is the prophet, and under the banner of Allah, under the banner of the God of Abraham, they begin to conquer the world, starting with Damascus in the 630s or 660s, and then spreading very quickly over the next 40 years across the Middle East, into Persia, into Egypt, and then by the year 700, all the way out to the Atlantic in present-day Morocco. And in 711, they cross the Straits of Gibraltar, and they begin the conquest of Iberia. And the high water mark of Islam will continue for another 20 years. They will cross the Pyrenees and begin the conquest of France, ending only in 732 AD with Charles Martel, the grandfather of Charlemagne, defeating a Muslim army 90 miles from present-day Paris at a place called Tours, the Battle of Tours, or the Battle of Poitiers, which is the high water mark of Islam in Western Europe. In Eastern Europe, right, we're not going to talk about the Turks, but that's a couple centuries in the future from what we're talking about. So Islam expands well into Europe in the 700s. And only is it under Charles Martel and Charlemagne that they're eventually pushed back across the Pyrenees, but they'll remain in Spain well into the 15th century. And what happens is this incredible success of early Islam, this incredible explosion into the world, starting in 632, 610, when Muhammad begins his mission, and the death of Muhammad is in 632, and then 732, a century after the death of Muhammad, Muslims are in control of Spain, North Africa, Egypt, and Persia, and pushing their way up into Central Asia. And as they do so, they find themselves with a gigantic problem. And the gigantic problem for Muslims is, how do you rule a people who are not Muslims? How do you conquer, as I always say, the Muslims after Muhammad are in the role of the dog that catches the car. The dog chases the car, and if it catches it, what's it going to do? How do you drive if you're a dog? I mean, the Muslims come out of the desert. They're they're like modern Bedouins. They're a semi-nomadic people who have very little urban culture. They have no system of large-scale governorship. They have no system of law beyond tribal law, which is very primitive. And the big problem for early Islam, and this is encountered in the first decades after the death of Muhammad. When Muhammad's alive, it's easy. You got a problem, you go ask Muhammad. He solves it. He's the prophet. He communes with God. God literally, according to Muslims, God's literally speak through Muhammad. That solves your problem. But as soon as he dies, there are no more prophets. He says he's the seal of the prophet. The bottle of prophecy is sealed with the death of Muhammad. So how do you do this? And what early Muslims do is, first off, they elect something called a caliph. And a caliph, the word caliph just means deputy. It's the Arabic word for deputy. It means a figure who will be in charge of the Muslims. They refer to him as the Amir al-Mu'minin, the prince of the faithful. And it's a semi-elected position, not elected in our sense, right? It's a consensus position. But what happens is that these early caliphs come up with a system that allows them to rule over large numbers of people who have been conquered who are not Muslims. Muslims are not allowed to forcibly convert people who are not pagans. If they're a monotheist, if you're a Jew or a Christian and eventually a Zoroastrian and a few other groups, if you're a monotheist, you're not supposed to be forcibly converted. The Quran recognizes that Jesus, in fact, the largest chapter in the Quran, the largest surah in the Quran, is about Mary and about the virgin birth of Jesus. They don't believe Jesus is the Son of God. They believe that he is instead another prophet, a previous prophet. So early Muslims have this high degree of respect for Christians and Jews. And they have a practical problem is you've conquered the city of Damascus, 100,000 people. And Damascus in the 7th century, in the 660s, Damascus is a Christian city. It's ruled by the Byzantines. You conquer into Jerusalem, you conquer into Egypt. And those are Christian territories. The Muslims are largely conquering Christian territories. Now, when you're in Persia, present-day Iran, those are Zoroastrians. And Zoroastrians, that's the ancient Persian religion. They have two gods. They have a good god and a bad god. So Muslims are like, well, the good god is God and the bad god is the devil. So you guys are, even though you have two gods, you're honorary monotheists. But the problem is that how do you deal with the population where you're a fraction, maybe 10% of the total population are Muslims? And the rules they come up with, the second caliph, a guy named Omar II of the caliphs, he comes up with a set of rules for ruling over non-Muslims. And the rules are something that comes to be known as Vimi. It's hard to pronounce. Arabic has some interesting consonants. There are 3 THs in Arabic, the, right? So 3. So Vimi is sometimes spelled Dhimmi. Because the hard TH sound, Vimi. But Vimi rules say the following: if you're a monotheist, it's okay to practice your religion. You have to do 3 things. One is you recognize that Muslims are in political control of this area, and therefore you have no say in it. Number 2, you can practice your religion, but you can't proselytize. So if you're Jewish or if you're Christian, you can go to church, you can go about your business. And as long as you're not trying to convert people, because only Muslims are allowed to try to convert people, you're safe in your religious practice. And the third is you pay a special tax known as the jizya. And this tax is because we don't expect you, as Muslim rulers, we don't expect you to serve in the military, so this tax will pay for your defense. And for many Christians, and for Jews in particular, who these rules are not onerous in any way, for many Christians, they represent a tax decrease. Because if you think about the tax schemes of the Byzantines, up to 1/3 of your, as an American, 1/3, 37%, but 33%, up to 1/3 of your income are going to pay for various services, protection, the 10th to the church, the local lord. And the Muslims have a very liberal tax policy. If you were a Reaganite, a conservative Republican, you would enjoy Muslim tax policies, which are that Muslims pay no taxes. Only conquered people pay taxes. It's free. It's a free economy, a free trade economy. Everyone has to learn Arabic. The coinage is good. And what happens during this Muslim centuries, the first 2 or 3 centuries, is there's a giant explosion in economic activity. And Muhammad is, unlike Jesus, who's a poor carpenter who's frequently skeptical of money, Muhammad is a rich merchant. So mercantile activity follows Islam in this big way. Well, the point being is that Christians and Jews under Islam are not excessively taxed. They're not oppressed. They're second-class citizens, let's be fair. They're not first-class citizens, they're second-class citizens, but they're free to practice their religion, and frequently they're beneficiaries of a very, very liberal and very powerful economic regime, an economic system that really takes off in the 9th and 10th centuries. So what you're seeing is, as Islam spreads, is that these conquered populations of monotheists. Now, if you're a pagan, if you're off worshiping Thor, that's bad news. They're going to force you to convert. The only people who are allowed to be forcibly converted to Islam are pagans. But for Christians and Jews and Zoroastrians, you're able to go about your business. And here's the sweetener to the deal. For many Christians and many Jews, conversion to Islam not only brings a tax abatement, you no longer pay taxes at all, but it also allows you to enter Muslim society. So what you see over time is that a significant portion of Jews and Christians will convert to Islam over the conquest arrives. You settle into your community, and as long as your mom and dad are alive, you don't convert. But when mom and dad die, maybe 10, 20 years down the road, you start to think about converting, and your children may certainly convert. And so we find over time that conversion will happen not through force, but through the relaxation of taxes and social benefit. John, do you have a question?
Yeah, so in popular definition of Islam, that I've heard of, Muslim societies are very strict moral laws.
Mm-hmm.
Women, do you see this in Andalusia, and is it very different from what
So this is a whole rabbit hole to go down, but I won't go too far into it. So and by the way, feel free to ask questions as you go along. I have no problem. I'm talking sort of extemporaneously here, but so early Islam, there's a whole argument in early Islam that women in the Arabian society, like in the Mecca and Medina society of the early Muhammad, those women are pretty free to go about. Many of the earliest followers of Muhammad are women. They play a very prominent role. His wife Khadija, he marries the boss's widow. She's 14 years older than he is, and he remains as his only wife until she dies, and then he marries several women. And then he marries one that's called Aisha and his daughter Fatima. So in early Islam, women seem to play a very prominent role, and as far as we know, they're not veiled. In fact, the group who are veiled is when you conquer Damascus, upper class Greek women are veiled. So it's when the upper class Byzantines begin to convert to Islam, they don't unveil their women, and now it becomes seen as why are our women unveiled when these recent converts, why are their women veiled? So it's really the Greeks from the upper class Byzantines that the veiling of women comes. The strict moral codes, the strict modern moral codes of Islam are kind of fascinating in a lot of ways. One is a law that's more cultural than it is Islamic. There's a very prominent guy named Suhaib Webb, whose real name was like James Webb. He was a convert from Oklahoma, a good Church of Christ boy, a convert from Oklahoma who is a prominent American imam. And in the present day, it's a big, like 6'3", blonde-headed, American Muslim. And Webb makes the point that a lot of what American Muslims do in the present day is really like Pakistani or Saudi cultural behavior. Like, American Muslims should be more integrated and live this American-style life. He gets a lot of pushback from it. So the argument about, Muslim moral codes is really a lot about people who are from very particular parts of the world that don't, have very particular local customs that are followed, So the Saudis are not particularly, until recently, not particularly enlightened, people with regard to the status of women. Whereas you go to places like Malaysia, and Muslim women have a much higher status in society. I mean, even the Pakistanis elected a female prime minister fairly recently. So so it's a very complex subject that has to do. Well, in Spain, Spain's the topic of the day. In Spain, this regime begins to arrive. In the 700s, as the Muslims move in, early 700s, that Muslim culture we're talking about, is still not the modern Muslim culture. Early Islam is like in flux. You really don't talk about like Islamic culture till you start getting into the late 700s, after they move their capital to Baghdad, after the capital of Islam really becomes Baghdad in 755. And at that point, things start to solidify. And I always make the case that early Islam is probably, the Muslims that move into Spain probably are not that different from the people who are there, in the sense that most of the Muslims who move into Spain, who conquer Spain in 711, are fairly recent converts from North Africa. They're Bedouin, and the Bedouin are largely Christian. North Africa was Christianized, Augustine of Hippo's in North Africa. And so it's a major center of Christianity. And the number of like Arabic speakers who come into Spain is actually fairly low. Most of the people who come into Spain are speakers of North African Berber dialects. So what you're seeing in early Spain in 711 is it's not really what we think of as modern Islam. Now, as the upper class Muslims begin to move into Spain, as we get a large influx of people from Syria and the Middle East, you begin to see the upper classes of Spain are becoming what we think of as more modern, Islam, more Islamic in that sense. And there's always a kind of disparity in Spain between the upper class, the ruling class, who have the literary culture, the high culture, which is based in Arabic, and the ordinary people on the street continue to speak something like, what we would call Romance, which is the intermediary language between classical Latin and Castilian, modern Spanish. Romance is the language of Spain. So people are speaking a Latinate language on the streets, and bilingualism is the norm for people who are into the governmental cultural matrix of Islam. So what you find is by the mid 700s is that Arabic is becoming Arabic is always the language of the top ruling class, but it's encompassing kind of the governmental and the middle class. And there's a space there in Spain for Christians who are becoming Arabized, who probably grow, Bob O'Gorman's reading a book by my advisor at Yale, a woman named Maria Rosa Minocal, and Minocal makes this point between what we call mother tongues and father tongues, right? Mother tongue is what your mom speaks to you. And, you'll never find anyone that has a more Southern accent than like a 7-year-old child. A 7-year-old child has the maximum Southern accent. And that's because, mom is speaking to the child in the language she grew up with, which is the language of her grandparents, which is typically a really accentuated version of that local dialect. So most of our young Christians and Muslims probably grow up speaking Romance. But then your father takes over at 5. Typically, your father has to educate you in the classical language. If you're an upper class Roman or a Visigoth, that language is going to be Latin. But increasingly in Spain, it becomes Arabic. Arabic is the language of the upper class. So men begin to learn Arabic to converse in public. And you begin to see this taking over the middle class and above families as that, because all your business is conducted in Arabic. But you may still well speak Romance, the pre-Spanish dialect before that. So what happens in Spain is, as the Muslims move in, we begin to see by the middle of the 700s, as things begin to settle down in the Middle East and begin to develop this extensive, what we think of as Islamic culture, that begins to translate into Spain. And in Spain, the main difference is there's a lot more Christians. It's a heavily Christian area. Baghdad is more Persian. It's more Zoroastrian. And the culture of Islam that develops in Baghdad, I often point out that Islamic culture has a matrix of Arabic. And what I mean by that is because God speaks to people in Arabic, you have to learn Arabic. But many of the people who are converted in those first centuries of Islam are like intellectual Greeks and intellectual Persians, they're the real intellectual powerhouse in the Middle East, are Persians and Greeks. And as they convert to Islam, they adopt Arabic as their language, but their ways of thinking are taken from the Byzantines and the Persians, the Sassanids. So you see, Islam becomes this heavily, at the top, it becomes a very intellectual, very powerful system. The great story of the 800s is when Muslims in Baghdad begin to translate all of the Greek classics into Arabic. Aristotle, Plato, the great doctors, Hippocrates, you just go down the list of classic Greek works, and starting in the late 700s through the 900s, almost all of them are translated into Arabic. And the Arabs have picked up things in the rest of the world, because by the 800s, Muslims are all the way into China. They're down through Southeast Asia. They're all across Central Asia, and they're in India. And if they're not conquering, they're also just trading in these regions. So one of the things they pick up in China that turns out to be monumentally important is they pick up paper. Christians write on parchment, which is a form of leather, very expensive material. But Muslims write on paper, which they've picked up from the Chinese. And what happens is there's a gigantic explosion in book culture and intellectual stuff going on in Baghdad. And this begins to filter outward. So you're beginning to see that it's not just that you've translated Aristotle into Arabic, it's that there's 50, 100, 200 Muslim philosophers who are writing commentary on Aristotle. The most important commentary on Aristotle is probably actually in some ways more important than Aristotle for medieval Christians, is a guy named Avicenna, who in the 12th century is a doctor in Persia, who writes this incredible commentary on Aristotle. And as Christians begin to translate into Latin from Arabic, a lot of these commentaries written by Muslims are brought into the West. In fact, the Muslims, it's in Baghdad that, and Spain plays a role in this, it's in Baghdad that Muslim philosophers begin to define what is the central question of the Middle Ages, the central question for Christians, for Muslims and Jews. And it's a question that we still wrestle with. It's a question that, you don't wrestle with, because I'm as a low church Protestant Church of Christ guy, I have to invent my theology from scratch. But you get to have Aquinas answer the question for you. And the question is, what does Athens have to do with Jerusalem? This is the central question of the Middle Ages. Meaning, here comes Aristotle, here comes Plato, and they give you a philosophy, a rationalist philosophy for interpreting the world, right? Here comes your revelation out of Jerusalem that tells you the Bible, they tell you what to do, what to believe. And as a person who believes in rationalist philosophy, why not take your Aristotelian or your Platonic philosophy and apply it to the tenets of your religion? So Muslims begin to wrestle with this question in Baghdad in the 800s. It's like, okay, we've learned philosophy, but we've got the Quran. And Avicenna comes to the conclusion, oh yeah, heck yeah, you can use Aristotle to prove that God exists, right? Yay, Athens works on Mecca. Meanwhile, there's a countervailing force in Muslim life that's like, philosophy is useless. You don't need philosophy. Just do what the Quran tells you. You don't need philosophy. Just do what the Bible tells you, right? So you have this is the central question. What does Athens have to do with Jerusalem? Or for Muslims, what does Athens have to do with Mecca, right? And so every philosopher in the Middle Ages is wrestling with this question. And some of them come up with the path that, you as Catholics, Aquinas is profoundly influenced by two Muslim thinkers. The first is Avicenna, and the second is a Spanish thinker named Averroes, Ibn Rushd, right? Averroes, who writes this really important commentary on Aristotle, and it's completely rationalist. So when Aquinas sits down to write his Summa, he's got Averroes and Avicenna in front of him. He's making reference to Aristotle. They interpret Aristotle because they've wrestled with the same problem. And Aquinas' systematic theology is an application of Aristotelian logic to the tenets of the Christian faith. And so the answer is, for Catholics, the answer has always been that Athens is the adjunct to Jerusalem. Athens is the way you approach Jerusalem. But for many people, that rejection of that, which ultimately that rejection wins in Islam, by the 900s, the forces in Islam that are saying philosophy has nothing to do with religion are beginning to win. And by the 1200s, they've completely won. They've eliminated the role of philosophy. But the role of philosophy is picked up in Toledo and in Spain, and it's there that the conquest of Christians. This is the other part of the story. I'm off track here a little bit. Excuse me. As always, my digressions are legendary. So what happens is that in Spain, right, this culture, the culture in Spain is quite spectacular in its own way, but it's a hybrid culture. And it's hybrid in the fact that there's a lot of Christians floating around. A lot of Christians are floating around in Spain, and they oftentimes occupy very high positions. One of the things that people are surprised by is that the Caliphs in Cordoba, the rulers in Cordoba, appoint the Christian bishops. The Christian bishops. Of course, if you know your medieval history, you know that until 1175, under Gregory VII, or 1075, under Gregory the Great, bishops are always appointed by the local lord, something called the investiture controversy, in which the papacy wins the right to appoint bishops. Until that point, the King of France appoints the French bishops. And in Spain, the Christian bishops are appointed by the Muslim caliph. And that's because the bishop is the Christian bishops are officials in the court of the Spanish caliphs, of the Andalusi caliphs. And so in Spain, you've got this culture where everything is conducted in Arabic, and in the 1000s, Arabic is the high culture. The Muslim classical age, the high period of Islam, is 750 to 1258, when the Mongols arrive in Baghdad. But that 500-year period, Muslims are way ahead of Christians. They're vastly richer, they're vastly more intellectual, and they're vastly more competent. And many people in the Christians who are in Spain are not looking to Paris. In the year 1000, Paris has 7,000 people. They're not looking to Rome, which is a backwater until after the year 1000. They're looking at Baghdad. If you're in Spain, you look to what's going on in Baghdad because that's the culture you live in. I point out that. If you're a Christian, if you're a Jew living in America, you speak English, you follow American trends. That's the culture you're in. Your religion is the culture. Your religion determines what you believe, but your culture shapes everything else. And so the culture of Spain is the high culture of Spain is the culture of Arabic. It's the culture of Islam. And for Christians and Jews who are allowed to go about their business, they adapt themselves to this. And there are huge benefits for doing so. Intellectual benefits, scientific benefits, you can just go monetary benefits, you can just go down the list. And so as Christians begin to come back, what happens is in 1010, the Muslims in the south fall into civil war. And this allows the little Spanish kingdoms around the periphery to finally start recovering. Until 1010, all the Spanish kings around the periphery, and there are half a dozen Spanish kingdoms, or Navarre, Aragon, Castile, Leon, the Counts of Barcelona. These are Christians, but they're all tributaries to the Muslims in Cordoba. And what that means is they send their daughters to marry into that dynasty. They send their sons to be educated there. Typically in the Middle Ages, if I'm the king and Bob is one of my dukes, his son comes to live with me. He's a hostage, and he's also it's ensuring that Bob behaves, but also ensures that my son, the future king, knows his future lords. This is how feudalism works. And in Spain, under Muslims, the exact same dynamic plays out. So most of the Christian kings of the Middle Ages until the 1000s grow up in Cordoba, or they spend significant times in Cordoba. Their sisters are married into those dynasties. They themselves are educated as good Arabs, as good Arab speakers. They're still Christian, but they speak Arabic and they know that culture very well. There are medieval kings in Spain who can sign. We have, Pedro of Navarre, who in the late 900s signs documents in Arabic, Latin documents. He only knows how to sign his name in Arabic, right? The Caliphs of Cordoba, the rulers of Cordoba, there are no greater Arabs in Spain except the Caliphs of Cordoba, and their descent, patrilineal descent, is how you measure it in Islam. It's father to son, father to son. That determines what you are ethnically. So they trace their lineage right back to Muhammad. Muhammad has no sons; he has only daughters. But one of Muhammad's daughters is their ancestor. So Muhammad is in their line, and yet by the time we get to the 900s, the Caliphs of Cordoba are blonde-haired and blue-eyed because they've married. So many of their mothers are Christian princesses. And what happens is, in the 1000s, this blows apart. There's a civil war that breaks out in the south of Spain, and the Christians in the north finally are able to take advantage of it. And they begin to dominate, because what happens is, what had been a unified kingdom in the year 1000, by 110 is blown apart into dozens of little bitty, like local petty kings, and the Christians in the north are able to take advantage of this and dominate. The kingdoms in the north are small, but they're bigger than like the city of Toledo or the city of Valencia, which is now an independent kingdom. And so what happens is, for the first time, the Christians in the north get on top, and for about 70 years, they're just content to extort money from the people in the south. No. The funny thing is, if you've read Machiavelli, you understand medieval politics, which is that everybody's a king in his own city, and the main power of Al-Andalus is that the main power of the Muslims is that they're unified. They're unified from 711 to 1010 when the civil war breaks out in Cordoba. And the problem is the Christians on the periphery are not unified. And so you have, I sometimes teach a class called the medieval Spains in plural. And so Christians, if you look at the relative strength between Christians and Muslims, the Muslims have this incredible intellectual tradition. They're rich beyond all belief. They're inheritors of this incredible trade network that goes all the way to China, down the east coast of Africa, all the way down to like Zanzibar, throughout the Indian Ocean, all the way across North Africa into Spain. Huge trade network. Intellectually, they're way beyond. They've got paper. Christians, the number of people who can read in Western Europe, the Christians who can read and write, pretty much, a fraction of 1%. Monks and nuns are like it. Like even aristocrats generally can't read in the year 1000. But there's one thing that Christians are better at than Muslims, and that's warfare. There's nothing more terrifying than a Christian knight. A Christian knight in heavy armor and a heavy horse just scares the wits out of Muslims. So Muslims will hire Christian knights to ride with them against rivals. And the Christian kings in the north will hire Muslim soldiers to fight against their fellow Christians. When I say it's Machiavelli, it's like, I've got my little kingdom, I'm not giving it up, but I need to hire friends to help me. So you find across the religious divide lots and lots of relationships. And again, it's perfectly normal because they grew up together. Like all these Christian kings had spent significant time in Cordoba. And in the 1000s, the Christian military power in Spain is able to bully these small Muslim kingdoms. They're able to bully them into paying tribute money, to paying extortion money. And the Christian kings in the north through the 1000s get rich on this. And it finally, and during this period, there are, really very few significant conquests. There's one in a place called Barbastro up in 1066, up against the Pyrenees Mountain, the small city. But other than that, the Christians are happy to be paid off by the Muslims in the south. And in the south, there's kind of a battle royale going on, where you start off with 30 some odd little kingdoms after the fall of Granada or Cordoba, and they end up with 9 sort of decent sized kingdoms, the petty kings of Spain, right? And so what happens is in 1085, Toledo, which is the farthest north of if you look at Spain, if you've been to Spain, you go to Toledo, and as you go north of Toledo, it's like you're in Eastern Oregon. I'm from California, so Eastern Oregon means it's a high desert that's colder than heck in the winter and hot and dry in the summer. And that's what the Meseta is. Madrid is the highest capital in Europe. People don't know that Madrid is like 1,800 feet. It's the highest capital in Europe. Like even Geneva in Switzerland is lower than Madrid. And so you go up into the Meseta, and where the Christians are in the north, there's a kind of a big open space there where nobody is. That's the barrier between Christian Spain and Muslim Spain. And Toledo is the final northern outpost of this. It's about 30,000 people in Toledo. The largest Christian city in Europe is Rome, which has like 10,000 people. There's 150,000 in Seville, maybe 250,000 in Cordoba. And these are Muslim cities. So in 1085, Alfonso VI, Toledo is sitting there, and Alfonso decides he's going to take Toledo in 1085. And so in 1085, Toledo instantly becomes the largest city in Christian Europe. And Toledo is unusual because it's about half Christian. It's actually got a very large Christian population living under a Muslim control. And so what happens is Alfonso rides in, and immediately all the Muslims in the south get scared, and they call in a Muslim empire in North Africa that's been a radical, hardcore, fundamentalist empire called the Almohads, and they're brought in to help keep the Christians from getting too powerful. And the first thing the Almohads do is they conquer the south and they unify Islam again the south. But Alfonso, against all odds, hangs on to Toledo. If you've been to Toledo, it's 3 sides are on a river, and it's cliffs all around. It's a very hard nut to crack militarily. And so what happens is Alfonso hangs on to Toledo, and the first thing that happens after that, the next thing that happens after that, is every scholar in Europe rushes to Toledo, because Toledo has this incredible libraries. And these are libraries full of Arabic books that are not just translations of ancient Greeks, but there's like medical stuff, because the Muslims, have gone to town on medicine. They've gone to town on astronomy, mathematics, algebra. The word algebra is a good Arabic word. You use Arabic numerals, right? The word zero is an Arabic word. And so what happens is you get people from all over Europe, monks, right? Those are the only people who can read and write. Monks start coming to Toledo to translate stuff into Latin. The other place this is also happening roughly at the same time, to a lesser extent, which is strange, to a lesser extent it's happening in Sicily. Because the second half of the 1000s, 1050 to 1100, somebody is once referred to as the Norman half century, the Norman French, right? In 1066, the Norman French conquer England, right? William the Conqueror. But the Normans are also really instrumental in conquering Sicily, roughly 1066 to 1080 something. So in Sicily, a Norman king sets up a multi-ethnic or multi-confessional kingdom in Sicily, and then Toledo is the other big conquest. And at the end of the century, in 1099, that's the conquest of Jerusalem under the first Crusade. So in that half a century, Toledo falls, Sicily falls, Jerusalem falls, and it's a lot of Normans, these Viking descended Frenchmen who are leading the charge here. But Toledo is the great intellectual center, and from Toledo, all of these translations start coming out. And it's the conquest of Toledo that kickstarts what one historian has called the Renaissance of the 12th century. In the 1100s, you see Europe is like suddenly everyone's like reading and writing. Economic activity is going wild, and that's because the routes to Jerusalem are open. You can just go down the list of like things that are starting to go in the 1100s. And a lot of that is the fallout from the conquest of Toledo intellectually, and then trade-wise, the fallout from Jerusalem. So what's going on is there in Toledo is that you've got a group of Christians, and these Christians are called Mozarabs. And this is what I wrote my dissertation about. The Mozarabs are Christians who are Arabized. Their public life is conducted in Arabic. And as a consequence, they know both Arabic, and a lot of them know Latin. So they're the ones that, as the scholars come from far away, people come from Scotland. There are monks who come from Scotland to Spain. My favorite is a guy named Herman the German. Hermanicus Germanicus is like he's a guy from the eastern part of Germany who comes to Toledo to look at medical texts and translates Avicenna, who's the great Aristotelian. Avicenna is the greatest doctor of the Middle Ages. He's this incredibly, in the 1100s, this incredible towering figure. When I say towering figure, what I mean is, like, at 17, he announces to the world at 17, I know all there is to know about medicine. It's like, what? And then you find that at 18 he's hired to be the personal physician to the Prince of Ray, like this province in Iran. The personal physician is like a 17-year-old, 18-year-old, and he says things. He unusually writes an autobiography, and he says, my father hired a tutor to teach me Aristotle, and I didn't really understand what he's saying, so I sat down to read Aristotle myself. I read it 43 times in a row, and after the 13th or 14th time, I began to understand what Aristotle meant. And I realized my tutor knew nothing. It's like that kind of, if you want to talk about like the 10 smartest people of all time, John von Neumann, Einstein, but Avicenna's in that category. He's like, Aristotle, Avicenna, they're like that, right? And so what happens is, this is what's being uncovered in Toledo. And so, universities are Christian, oops, there's my timer. Universities are Muslim inventions. The oldest universities in the world are in Cairo and in Morocco. Universities grow up in the Muslim world, and by the 1000s, they're being introduced to Europe. And they're introduced, they really take off in the 1100s. And, the University at Salamanca in Spain is one of I think the second or third oldest university in the Christian world. So what's going on in Spain is that this contact with Islam is really, when Christians have nothing going for them, except they've got this military ability. But that military ability is such that when Toledo falls, when Jerusalem falls, and when Sicily falls, it just opens up this material, this intellectual material to the rest of the world. And we can spend days here. I have entire classes on this topic, semester-long classes talking about, how Islam shapes the Middle Ages. And again, remember, people get, Americans get a little freaky about the role of Islam in public life. And I think in some ways that's not entirely wrong. But I have to remind people that, Islam's not really an alien religion in the sense that it's still Abrahamic. Jesus is not seen as the Son of God, he's seen as a prophet. A lot of what Muslims do, Sharia is really a development of, if I were saying this to Muslims, I'd have to be very careful, but you're not. So Sharia is really an outgrowth of late Roman law. The way it functions is different than late Roman law, but a lot of its tenets are found in late Roman law. People who write about that get yelled at a lot, but it seems pretty clear to me. And the reason is because Islam conquers much of the central part of Islam. That the conquests are of Christian territory, and the early converts are Christian intellectuals. And so as a consequence, Islam is heavily influenced by Christianity. Now, that doesn't mean, that it's correct. I don't think it's correct at all. But it does mean that in general, it's not really as alien as we like to believe. And as Christians who come out of, Catholics in particular, who come out of the Middle Ages with this incredibly powerful theology, the theology of Aquinas. One of my colleagues at Lipscomb, who's we're all good Church of Christ people over there. But I'm married to a Catholic, so I'm allowed to say a lot of things. But and she's a much better person than I am, so I have to worry that one of us might be going the one way and the wrong way. It's always a little, but I have a friend over there who's a philosopher, and he has systematic theology envy, which means, he's supposed to have our low church Church of Christ Theology, which, whatever that is. But when he reads Aquinas, he's nodding his head. And that's because that theology, that Aristotelian theology that comes out of Aquinas' study of Aristotle, Avicenna, and Averroes, the two Muslims, that theology is like really powerful. If you accept Aristotle's conclusions, then it's kind of hard to get around. It's kind of hard to get around a lot of things. In fact, I oftentimes, I shouldn't do this, but I will. In my last minute here, I oftentimes find I have a better explanation for transubstantiation than many Catholics I know, which is that transubstantiation is really an Aristotelian belief about substances. That, if you believe that the substance is what is the anyway, it's a long discussion, but and I find, I have to be careful here again, I find it somewhat convincing, the argument for transubstantiation, but it has to do with Aristotelian philosophy and the nature of substances. And that comes out of this contact with Islam, because these Muslims are the ones who are trying to do something similar with their own religion using Aristotle, and they write extensively about it, and Toledo is the place where all this gets translated into Latin. I have a couple minutes left before you're supposed to go. Any questions? Yes, sir.
Different,
Yeah.
Islam, Sufi,
Yeah.
Did that become part of the story sooner or later?
So Shias are really, you never see Shias outside of like Persia and the Middle East. Shia starts off as a political dispute about who becomes the next caliph. Muhammad has a son-in-law. He has his wife. His wife is Aisha, and she's a young woman when he marries her, and she gives birth to the daughter Fatima. And Fatima gets married to Muhammad's cousin, a guy named Ali. And Ali would, you would think Ali would be the natural successor of Muhammad, but the problem is when he dies, Ali's faction loses the political struggle for who follows Muhammad. And so the powerful family, the Umayyads. The Umayyad family wins, and Ali eventually becomes caliph 20 years after Muhammad's death, and then he's murdered, right? And so what happens is the followers of Ali believe that Ali has like a special role. He's not a prophet, but he has divine inspiration in terms of like how you interpret things. Like no one else has divine inspiration except Muhammad, but Ali seems to have a little bit of it. So what starts as a political split becomes a religious split. And the Shiites are all followers of Ali, right? Sufis are, there's actually three paths, right? The three religious paths, right? Here's Athens. What does Athens have to do with Jerusalem? One is you can use philosophy to prove your religion is correct. Aquinas doesn't need divine revelation about God. He can go to Aristotle and say, oh, look, you use a syllogistic reasoning, God exists, right? You can use, there's several syllogistic proofs of the existence of God. So that's one. The other, the revelation guys, like the hardcore fundamentalist Muslims, like, you don't need any of that philosophy. Here's the Quran, it's the revelation of God. Here's the Bible, it's the revelation of God. You don't need philosophy for that. The old lady, there's the old lady who prays in the corner. She doesn't know anything about philosophy, and she's as pious as they go, right? Revelation is sufficient. There's the third branch that develops in Islam called Sufis. And Sufis believe, and this is influential too, the third path, right? You don't need revelation, you don't need philosophy, you just go talk to God yourself. And if you practice, Sufis believe that if you practice really strict prayer, maybe some physical austerity, like asceticism, like you fast or whatever, eventually you have a firsthand personal experience of God, right? You connect with God directly in a very tangible way. They're mystics, right? You don't need philosophy, you don't need revelation, just go talk to God yourself. And that actually is and that may actually come, that may actually come from like Buddhism. There's like a strong Buddhist element that infiltrates Islam in Central Asia. But so what happens is Sufis are all over the Muslim world, and they present as Orthodox Muslims. They follow everything there, but then they have this heretical set of beliefs about, personal experience. Jewish people pick this up, and there are Jewish mystics in the Middle Ages. Something like Kabbalah comes out of contact with Sufis, but Christians have it. And in Spain, there are Muslim Sufis, a guy named Ibn Arabi. There's a very famous Jewish Sufi named, Jewish mystic named Ibn Ezra. And then, of course, you get someone like Ramon Lull, who's a Catholic mystic who learns Arabic and is reading all this stuff. And he writes a book called The Book of the Beloved, which is all about how you're in love with God and God loves you. And it's all about this very physical, very personal relationship with God in a very mystical way. So you find that there's strong elements of mysticism in all three monotheistic faiths, and they're coming from the same place as the Aristotelianism and as the fundamentalism, which is that the central question of the Middle Ages is, what does Athens have to do with Jerusalem? And the answers are these very defined paths that people take. Other questions? I think I have 1 minute left. Other questions? Well, thank you very much for your time. See you next week. Yeah, next week. Yeah.